of the board of the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation, and it's my honour to be your host for today's Gambling Harm in Mind event. So welcome to everyone who's joined the call. I understand from the two events last week there's been terrific attendance, and today we've got another huge number of people who've signed up to attend in this virtual format. So it's terrific to see that it's attracted so much strong interest from not only around the country, but also I can see from the list around the world as well. So thank you for tuning in. If you're comfortable, it'd be great to see everyone's faces. I know people are often juggling different things or needing to have a quick snack. And on that note, I do want to let you know at the outset that we will have a break partway through proceedings. So there will be a short coffee toilet break coming up. But to start the formal proceedings, it is also my honour to introduce to you all Aunty Georgina Nicholson. She's a proud Wurundjeri elder who's well known to many in our community. Aunty Georgina has been a really good friend to the foundation, attending and opening a number of events. And I'm pleased to hand over to her this morning for the official welcome to country. So the floor is yours, Aunty Georgina.
Well, thank you, Alison. It was a beautiful introduction. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Georgina Nicholson, and I am a proud Wurundjeri Wurrung woman. Wurundjeri being part of the Kulin Nation. The Kulin Nation consists of 5 clans, and they are Wurundjeri, Buninyong, Wathaurong, Tanarong, and Dja Dja Wurrung. Wurundjeri being all of Melbourne CBD and surrounding country, extending north to the Great Dividing Range, east to Mount Baw Baw, south to Mordialloc Creek, and west to the mouth of Werribee River. So I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to our ancestors who lived, walked on this land as free spirits for millennia. I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait people who are online with us today from wherever traditional country you're on. I would like to acknowledge all the traditional owners of the country that you are on and pay my respects to you all and to your elders. I'm also very pleased to be doing the welcome for VRGF again, which they're a good mob, so thank you. I would also like to acknowledge Michaela Settle, MP member for Buninyong, board member Alison Roberts, and any other dignitaries that we have online today. Womanjika Wurundjeri Balak, Yemen Kundibik. So I'd just like to tell you what I've said in our Wurrung language. That is, welcome to the land of the Wurundjeri people. So my mother, Martha Margaret Nicholson, nee Terrick, was delivered by her grandmother, Granny Jemima, and that was on Corrandirk Aboriginal Mission near the present-day town of Hillsville. So Granny Jemima was already teaching our mother the importance of connection to country, culture, and caring for one another. Years later, our mother met a deadly Irish man called Patrick, and they met on a blind date in Melbourne in the early 1930s. In 1937, Mummy and Daddy were married, and back then it was in a registry office, and they had 16 children. No time for gambling. I thought I'd say that anyway. The 16 children, 8 girls and 8 boys, no twins, all single babies, so no cheating, LOL. The youngest of the 16 children is myself, and my sister Pat Ockwell is the oldest. Pat Ockwell is an amazing senior elder. She's still quite active, you know, but she turned 83 last year, and that is a milestone for an Aboriginal woman to reach that age. Well, they say with our life expectancy, we don't live as long as other cultures. There's about a 12 to 15-year gap there, and that's a huge gap for our people. We do have too much sorry business going on, but, you know, we must carry on the culture for, you know, our ancestors did, and for my mother and her mother and so on have done for us. Aboriginal culture is the oldest living continuing culture there is. It dates back to 80,000 years plus. I would like to acknowledge that people are online all over the world today. So my heart goes out to you all that are still in severe lockdown. For people that have lost their lives, my heart goes out to you. I'm very sorry. Just try to be strong and follow your leader, and you'll come out of this, I'm sure. We've had good leadership in Victoria, I believe. So, yeah, we're out of it now. But still take care, take care of yourselves. I just want to share with you that the traditional owners of Australia are Aboriginal people, and we have never ceded our sovereignty. And up to date, there has been no treaties with us, but they're working on that at the moment. So that'll be exciting when that all happens. So I'd just like to say, well, Wurundjeri people would like to say to you all, respect the land, the waters, the flora, fauna, and respect each other. And please take care, everyone. And thank you so much for having me this morning. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Aunty Georgina. That was a really wonderful welcome, and for sharing also a little bit about your family. What a life, and also it sounds like you have inspirational siblings and elders among your family, and that's wonderful to hear. I love hearing, in particular at the moment, from women's voices, and I think you have amazing stories of care and connection from which I know I could learn a lot. I think we could all learn a lot. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like us all to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which we are sitting on this virtual call. For me, it's the Buninyong people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I would also like to add my acknowledgement of some people who we have here today. So you heard from Aunty Georgina that Michaela Settle MP is with us, member for Buninyong. So she's stepped in to represent the Minister for Consumer Affairs, Gaming and Liquor Regulation. So thank you very much, Michaela, for being here today. We also have the Foundation's Board Chair, Tas Musafiriadis, with us on the call. You can wave your hand for those who don't know Tas. We've got a number of other of our Foundation board members and advisory committee members. We also have our CEO, Shane Lucas, joining us, and a number of Foundation staff, I understand. I'd also like to welcome our three expert speakers who are joining us for the rich content section of today's proceedings. So we have with us Toby Kent, consultant and former Chief Resilience Officer from the City of Melbourne. Welcome, Toby, and thank you for being with us today. Professor John Gleason, Director, and Dr. Valentina Lorenzetti. I knew I'd do that. Deputy Director of the Healthy Brain and Mind Research Centre at the Australian Catholic University. So thank you both also. So in opening, I just wanted to say that I know for all of us in different ways, the last 12 months have been tough, but we've also got a reasonably uncertain feeling future. I mean, here we are still a year on a Zoom call rather than an in-person event, which hopefully will soon be a thing of the past. But what we know that the lockdowns have demonstrated, not just here, but around the world, is the importance of mental health and well-being, as well as emotional resilience to deal with pressures and shocks that life can throw our way. And I know for some of us, seeing our children work through that has been a really interesting and challenging at times experience too. But it's particularly so for those who are already experiencing challenges, including those experiencing gambling harm. So while the relationship's not well understood, gambling harm often coexists with mental health issues, and we know that achieving better mental health can help a person overcome problems with their gambling, but also vice versa. Advancements in fields such as neuroscience, digital innovation, and mental well-being are finding new ways to help people manage or overcome the effects of gambling harm and addiction in their lives. And today, we are really fortunate to have with us experts in those areas, in resilience, in addiction and brain change, and digital innovation in mental health. And I'm really excited to hear from them. So all of them have been given what is undoubtedly a challenge of telling us about their amazing work in plain English, so that those of us who are not neuroscientists, which I would hazard is most of us on the call, can understand, and we'll look forward to hearing from them. But first up, it's my privilege to formally introduce to you the member for Buninyong and a very good friend of the Foundation, Michaela Settle. As many of you will know, Michaela is passionate about addressing gambling harm and mental health issues, and she's maintained a keen interest in the work that we do here at the Foundation. She understands the challenges faced by those who are affected by gambling harm and is a strong advocate for positive change, openly and generously sharing her own experiences of harm in working towards this goal. We're really delighted to have you with us again today, Michaela. Please, can everyone join me in welcoming Michaela?
Thank you, Alison. Look, it's really lovely to be here. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which we're meeting. For me here in Ballarat, it's the Wurundjeri people, and they have been extraordinary custodians of some fairly beautiful land and waterways up this way. So I pay my deep respect to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge Aunty Georgina Nicholson. That was a lovely welcome to country. One of the things I really enjoy about welcome to country is learning about other people, other mobs and their history. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to acknowledge some of the important people with us today, which of course includes Cass Musaferiadis, who's the VRGF chair, Alison Roberts, who is a board member and our wonderful MC today, and other VRGF board members, but particularly I would like to acknowledge the people that are with us today from the Lived Experience Advisory Committee. I'm a lived experience person, and I know that it takes courage to keep sharing it. So I thank those people on that committee very much for their commitment. And of course to Shane Lucas, who is the CEO. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our expert speakers, Toby Kent from the City of Melbourne, and Professor John Gleason, Director at the Valentina Lorenzetti of the Healthy Brain and Mind Research Centre. It's going to be a fascinating session, and I'm very much looking forward to it. I'm pleased to be joining you for this important conversation as part of the Foundation's Gambling Harm in Mind series, and to be representing Minister Horn, who sends her apologies. Gambling harm is an issue about which I'm passionate, so I'm always happy to support the work of the Foundation. And I want to thank you for your interest today in today's session to discuss the notions of resilience and examine how individuals, organisations and communities can tolerate change. Firstly, I'm pleased to announce the upcoming commencement of a new campaign aimed at those experiencing or at risk of gambling harm. This campaign encourages people who are experiencing gambling harm to talk to someone who gets it. Many people who experience gambling harm keep their situations a secret because of shame and guilt. And I certainly know in my situation, my husband at the time wasn't able to talk about it. And it really is incredibly important to get people to feel comfortable to reach out. This campaign emphasises that gamblers help counsellors understand what people are going through and can help to change the way you're thinking. This is all part of a push to alleviate the stigma that is so often associated with gambling and acts as a barrier to people seeking support. The campaign will also provide information to family and friends on how to get help, as gambling harm affects not only the person who gambles, but people close to them. I know when I was going through the situation that really there wasn't that support there, and I'm delighted that our services now wrap around many, many more people. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, we were all reminded of the importance of mental health and well-being, as well as our ability to be emotionally resilient. The need for connection and support was clear, particularly for those experiencing gambling harm, as we know that this and mental health issues often coexist. So I'm really pleased to be able to announce today that the Victorian Government will invest $600,000 into new research to investigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the gambling environment and the implications for associated behaviours and harm. The findings will be a fantastic tool in assisting the Foundation and the government to shape future initiatives and activities to prevent and reduce gambling harm in the Victorian community. The Victorian government has made its commitment to mental health very clear. We have promised to implement all of the recommendations from the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system. I'm very pleased to report that the Foundation is looking closely at these recommendations and considering how to ensure the best interests of Victorians that are affected by gambling harm and mental health issues can be best supported. The Gambling Harm in Mind series and the broad range of Foundation programs and activities reflect the government's commitment to continue finding ways to effectively tackle gambling harm. I thank today's speakers, Mr. Kent, Professor Gleason and Dr. Lorenzetti for sharing their knowledge and expertise on how we can tackle these issues as a community. So thank you everyone for participating, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing all that is discussed today.
Thanks very much, Michaela, and thank you to you for your personal passion and support for the work, but also for what you've spoken about today in terms of the government's ongoing support and investment in understanding new ways of doing things, but also new knowledge that helps us do our work better. So thank you for all of that. Our next speaker is Toby Kent, who I briefly introduced earlier, but now I'm going to hand the floor over to him and just say a couple of words about Toby. Toby was Australia's first Chief Resilience Officer at the City of Melbourne, where he led Resilient Melbourne, an initiative that helps cities around the world prepare to meet physical, social and economic challenges. Toby will talk about the meaning of resilience and how it differs for individuals, communities and organisations. So for those listening, there will be time for Q&As at the end of today's session. So if you are familiar with the chat function on the side of your screen, please put your questions into the chat function as you think of them. And the super team at the Foundation will be collating and passing them on, so we'll be able to share them and have them answered. So otherwise, please, can everyone join me in making Toby welcome? Over to you, Toby.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Honourable Michaela Settle and the Victoria Responsible Gambling Foundation for the invitation. Thank you too to Georgina Nicholson, and if I could extend also reflect that my acknowledgement that we're meeting on the country of traditional custodians wherever we are, and pay respects to elders past, present, emerging, and of course those joining on the call. Now, Alison mentioned kind of not, unfortunately I was never in a position to use really complicated language that some of the neuroscientists may do, but in deconstructing resilience as was put into the frame of this, I'll try not to be too esoteric, although I will spend a bit of time really sort of pulling apart what we mean by resilience before then moving from that definitional thing into thinking about some of the challenges that we faced creating thriving communities, as well as what that might mean for some of the broad social interventions. So starting with this point about resilience, firstly, it is not an end state. Resilience is a series of processes and a disposition of individuals or groups at any given moment in time. So somebody may be profoundly resilient one year, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're equipped to be so the next. Further, I think we should also recognize that, particularly at this time in history when resilience has become such a fashionable word, that it is a set of qualities that we all want to possess, but we rarely want to have to demonstrate. I sometimes say no one wants to tell you how resilient they were on their holiday. And for me, that kind of neatly encapsulates, that it's, again, both desirable, but only at certain moments. Now, another thing about resilience is, and part of its value, it is a word that we all inherently understand. But the flip side of that is it'll mean something a little bit different to all of us. So I think it is worth just taking a minute to think about the definition before we kind of move into some deeper content. Now, most of the definitions orient around similar kinds of themes. The one that I have most worked with was created by the Resilient Cities Network that Alison mentioned in her introduction. And this has been drawn from many other actors, the UN, and so forth, in their definitions. And the way it comes out is like this: that resilience is about the ability of institutions, organizations, systems, businesses, communities, and individuals, and their ability to adapt, to survive, and to thrive in the face of whatever chronic stresses and acute shocks that they face. Now, before we move on from that, inferred within that is a degree of anticipation. So it's not just about a reactive thing, it's also about being able to predict, preempt, and at times avoid the undesirable impacting. And so I think we should kind of take into this thinking of, or definition of resilience as being about the ability to anticipate, adapt, thrive, survive and thrive in the face of chronic stresses and acute shocks. And if you bear that in mind around the ability to thrive, that's why in this next few minutes, I'm really going to talk about some of the challenges to thriving. I think it's really important that we have what is actually our ideal state rather than simply just what are the things that we want to avoid. So resilience thinking and practice is very much built around that interplay of the stresses and the shocks. I'm going to mainly talk about some of the stresses that face places like Melbourne and are really prevalent in towns, in particular towns and cities across Australia. But as I do that, I also know that this audience will be very attuned to the reality that when disasters or acute shocks do strike, it is those, be they assets or people, who are already most stressed that wear the brunt of those shock events most profoundly and for longest. We see this, unfortunately, we have the reality of bushfires, and that's obviously pretty strong in people's minds after the last year. And we know that following an event such as a bushfire, we see those broader undesirable social consequences kicking in. So increased levels of family violence, alcoholism, gambling, and so forth. So let's just spend a bit of time thinking about some of those kinds of stresses that, broadly speaking, characterize Australian cities, and as I say, definitely Melbourne. We're seeing profound demographic change, both aging populations as well as, in many cases, growing younger populations. Younger populations, and to pick up on that theme of change and the ability to deal with change, both, I think Professor Gleason would pick up some of this, but we're also moving into a point where our young people have no idea of what their employment opportunities, you can't even begin to imagine what it would be like. So how do you even begin to put in place that coping mechanism for change? So demographic change at both ends of the age spectrum. Social inequality broadly and growing social divides. And urban sprawl, which is not always considered by many policymakers as a chronic stress, but is fundamentally is so, and I'll touch on some of that. Also, COVID-19 is a really interesting thing to reflect on, because it is both an acute shock in terms of a profound, sharp event that profoundly impacts at a broad level. But at the same time, its protracted nature actually means has also takes on many of the features of a chronic stress, and certainly many of the things that will be the ongoing challenges coming out of COVID-19 are very much in that chronic stress space. So just to give you a couple of examples around that, the Australian Council of Social Services and University of New South Wales have already done work looking at the anticipated, the existing as well as anticipated impacts of COVID-19. Examples of that include, for those who are broadly employed, who have access to work, are seeing reduced working hours. We know that women, young people, and the lower paid are being most profoundly impacted. And on the flip side, we are also seeing, both in Melbourne and Sydney, record house prices being achieved, which means that we are further locking in the social challenges around inequity, rental, and ownership stress. So even at that level, we can see a bit of that interplay between the shocks and the stresses. On the urban sprawl front, Jane Frances Kelly and Paul Donegan, when they were both at the Grattan Institute, produced a very good book called City Limits. And in that, they took a look at the Australian urban growth model. And they found a number of often understood but not always correlated impacts. And so what they discovered was that with increased commute times, while they didn't necessarily claim it was causal, there were very strong and deep levels of correlation around increased commuting times, increased levels of mental health, or mental ill health, increased family violence, increased use of alcohol. You hope not while they're commuting, but anyway, flippancy aside, and more seriously, really some very profound effects just coming from that built form, and the fact that when people are commuting, they don't actually have time to spend with their families, let alone to do some of the more traditional things around building community connections and so forth. And I'll come back to that point around community connection. In the context of acute shocks, Professor Daniel Aldrich from Northwestern University has done a lot of research into how communities cope with catastrophic events. He particularly has spent time in the Fukushima prefecture, understanding how communities responded to the triple impacts around the tsunami nuclear fallout of several years ago. And what Professor Aldrich has found, and he's been to Victoria a number of times to both continue this research and to present, is that the greatest determinant of a community's ability to recover from acute shock events is the level of social connection that exists before the event happens. So if you begin to put some of those things together, we also then need to think about, as I say, what are some of the places that we're developing? We have a model of urban development in Australia that is essentially too often a pokies-led development model, where you see this in places like Mitchellshire on the northern boundaries of Melbourne, where we are literally turning paddocks into future communities. But the only thing, very often the only bit of social infrastructure there at the beginning is a pub with many, many pokie machines. And that's because the pokie companies are too often those who are most willing to invest upfront because they know how quickly they're going to get the return on their investment. In allowing that, and indeed in many ways encouraging that, we are locking in profound social challenges to come ahead. We know that Australians lose more money than any other nation to gambling. And again, linking that with the COVID-19 situation, the Australian Gambling Research Centre, in surveying 2,000 regular gamblers, that of those 2,000 surveyed, the number of them gambling more than 4 times a week increased during COVID from 23% to 32%. And of those, 79% already identified themselves as being at risk or indeed already experiencing significant harm from gambling. Now, gambling is a really interesting one, and I'm not really here to talking about gambling. There are many on this call much more with much more profound understanding of gambling and its associations than I am. But gambling is both, in many ways, a symptom of chronic stresses, and also the way that some people, often those in stress situations, will respond to the impact of acute shocks. So it is, the other thing that's interesting about it is it can be an indicator of other social challenges that may come down the line. And so one of the things that I'll talk to very shortly, and again I think might be picked up by Professor Gleason, is what are some of the digital interventions that we can use to better understand and anticipate, to put in place the right kinds of, or indeed, to borrow that definition, to even sometimes maybe what can we avoid rather than just responding to things going wrong through our interventions. Now, one of the things that is interesting about this framing of resilience is that some of our normal indicators are not necessarily the things that indicate resilience. I'll just tell a quick story that lovely man, I'm sure many of you knew him, the late David Turnbull, who was the former chief executive of, well, lastly of Mitchellshire, and before that Whittlesea. And David told me a story about what he referred to in his time at Whittlesea Council in northern Melbourne as the tale of two valleys. And in that, in Plenty Valley, which was known for its large houses, nice-looking cars, and was seen to be generally affluent, they were the community that was most likely to regularly miss a meal, particularly the adults, because they were so stretched on their mortgages and their car repayments that any change in the price of fuel or mortgage or interest rates can really profoundly make the difference between their ability to make ends meet or not. Also, as they sat within their big houses and nice driveways and so forth, there was actually very little social connection. And meanwhile, when they did the same survey in Thomastown, which is known as being a more, or at least an area that is scores lower on the CIFA index, no one ever, or very few people ever missed a meal, even though they had much less income. And the reason for that was fundamentally very strong social connections and a willingness to share in their, or to be open about shared problems. And that meant that if someone was having a really bad week, they would very often simply ask a neighbor to help out, and that was expected to be reciprocated at some moment in time. So what does all this mean in terms of interventions, not just in a gambling context, but in social policy more broadly? I think one of the things, and again, I'm hoping John Gleason might pick up some of this, is around self-determination theory and the psychological needs that underpin well-being and motivation. Three of those are around autonomy, or those three are around autonomy, competence, and connectedness. Now, I've touched a little on connectedness, but if you think again of those families in Plenty Valley, you know, there is an argument that he had given up a degree of autonomy in seeking that autonomous state of their nice individual house, etc., but they had ceded a certain amount of autonomy to those to whom they owed repayments or so forth. Or you could say that was a level of competence where they were they incompetent in managing certain things, and as I touched on, they'd already reduced those connectedness. Now again, I'm using it as a framing. I'm certainly not suggesting that applies to everyone in Plenty Valley or so forth, but there were things that we can draw from that to begin to think out more broadly. What it also means And I did some work with a community recovery committee in northeastern Victoria recently, and recovering from the recent or last year's fires. And this recovery committee, we got them to map where they were on their recovery journey and where they thought the rest of the community were. And to a person, they all felt that they were slightly ahead of the rest of the community. And when we digged into that, the fundamental difference was the degree of agency that they felt. By being on that committee, the actions that they were taking, they actually felt that they were taking control of their own destiny, even though they didn't necessarily have true control over it. So what does that mean in the final couple of minutes? I think there are two things as we seek to address a range of policy outcomes and interventions. One is around anticipation, and the other is connection. So on anticipation, we so often know what the social outcomes will be of urban design decisions, development decisions. We know what the likely consequences of catastrophic events will be. And yet we too rarely actually intervene early enough to stop the things going wrong, when that is a choice that we make. Part of that, to move on to the connection, is we have too often a lack of connection between institutions, between sectors, between departments, even within institutions. And so to see us be collectively more resilient, and particularly if we want to help those who are most vulnerable, we need to understand that those who are most vulnerable frequently demonstrate some of the greatest qualities of resilience. So how do we empower them to have more agency and really build from a strengths-based approach? How do we then make sure that individuals and groups within communities are profoundly connected? And then final thing for all of us who are active in this space is around collaboration as a fundamental part of connectedness, but also understanding that we generally work in areas which are under-resourced. The most difficult or the most important things to do when we're under-resourced is to collaborate. The most difficult thing to do when you're under-resourced is to collaborate, because it actually takes a huge amount of effort, energy, and indeed resource to collaborate well. But nonetheless, as I round out exactly on 20 minutes, that is, I think, the greatest thing that we can do together, to work together, to anticipate, and then come together to be better connected.
Thank you so much, Toby. And doesn't everyone love a speaker who sticks to their exact allotted time? So thank you. So many interesting things in that. Just a reminder that if people have questions, pop them in the chat, and we will come to a Q&A session at the end. I know my mind's whirring with things to do with the lockdown and community connection, and even the way our neighbourhood started speaking to each other in ways that we hadn't before. So there's this sort of community resilience as well as being required at an individual level. So, but I won't get into that. We are going to take a short break now and give everyone the opportunity to stretch their legs, put on a cup of tea, and then we'll come back for our next speaker, Professor John Gleason. So thank you so much, Toby. It'd be great if we could see everyone back here in 10 minutes. So that'll be at 10:51. And then we'll kick off straight at that time. So thank you. We'll see you in a moment.
Hey, John, can you hear me?
Hey. Hi, Erin.
Hi. For your presentation, if you just click up on display settings up in your top toolbar, I think you have to change the view because otherwise we can see notes and everything, and swap to presenter view, I think will mean we can see it. Yeah, it's hard because I think sometimes we see things differently.
How's that?
Perfect. That's perfect. All good for you, Alison? Wonderful. Thank you.
Great.
These breaks are important in a long session, but the challenge is getting everyone back.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's just put my slides on my other screen. It's a little bit annoying, isn't it? Hopefully that's okay. I'm not looking too far off into the distance.
Alison, do you have a Twitter handle, the VRGF? Does he have a Twitter handle that we can use?
Erin?
Yes, I will just, we do have a Twitter handle. I believe, wait a second, I will get the exact name and I'll shoot it through to you, Valentina, on message.
It's at VRGF.
There you go. Thanks, Fiona.
I had too many screens open already to flick over to Twitter. Right. Well, I'm really keen that we start back on time, and I can see from the number of participants, that we're almost back where we were before the break. So hopefully everyone has rejoined and got their cup of tea. So we're now on to welcoming, and it's my pleasure to welcome Professor John Gleason, who is Director of the Healthy Brain and Mind Research Centre at the Australian Catholic University. For those who don't know him, John is a clinical psychologist who's worked for 30 years with people affected by mental health disorders. His research interests are in the development and evaluation of innovative psychological interventions for serious mental health problems. And today he's going to speak with us about digital innovation in mental health and wellbeing, and how apps and digital platforms can support an individual's psychological wellbeing. I know I'm really looking forward to it. So please join me in welcoming John. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Alison, for the very kind introduction. And also I'd like to thank Aunty Georgina for the wonderful welcome, and also Michaela. And I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's ironic, isn't it, in the midst of the pandemic, when we're relying so much on digital technology, that we're having a presentation on that topic. I guess, as I've kind of joked to a lot of friends and colleagues, that the coronavirus didn't know we had the internet, didn't wait until we were ready, but it's certainly highlighted, I think, really brought to the forefront of our consciousness, our relationship with digital technology, so much more. And so what I'm aiming to achieve this morning is to provide a bit of a status report on research into digital innovation in mental health. And I should sort of highlight that my particular perspective comes from, I guess, the more severe, serious end, if you like, of mental health problems, both for those suffering from mental health problems and also family members. That's been where most of my work has been. And I'm also going to weave into this a question about the priorities for intervention. And I guess the spoiler alert is that it'll be focusing there particularly on the prospects for mental well-being, sometimes also referred to as positive mental health, flourishing, personal growth, and as we heard Toby outline also the construct of resilience. And I'm also going to be highlighting the issues for further development in this area, including both the problems, limitations, and opportunities. And when I'm talking about digital interventions in mental health, I'm really most focused on those that have the potential to be scaled up, you know, through the use of obviously the internet or mobile apps and so on, not so much referring to telehealth, which of course is proved to be invaluable again during the pandemic, but it's just doesn't come within the scope of my presentation today. So I think you'll agree that we're very well placed here in the state of Victoria to understand the limitations of our mental health system. I think the Royal Commission really has been a wonderful opportunity to synthesize the difficulties from many perspectives, most notably those with lived experience. And again, it's very encouraging to hear Michaela highlight again this morning the government's commitment to addressing the recommendations in the Royal Commission report. And if you're not aware, you might be interested to know that the final report of the Commission includes a substantial section on innovation. A lot of attention is actually given there to digital interventions. So I think we're really poised to see, I think, a serious growth and development in innovation here in the state of Victoria. But the problems that we've experienced here are, of course, not unique, and they're reflected in many issues in mental health services around the world. And one of the biggest issues, I guess, is the problem of access to effective mental health services. In many ways, our services are outdated, conceived originally in a sort of mid-20th century. And here's just some statistics that highlight some of these problems in other countries around the world. So, for example, half of the adults with mental illness in the US receive no treatment. Over 60% of US youth with depression do not receive treatment. And we know that in addition to that, demand is growing. There's been some influential population-based studies of cohorts of young people in the late 20th century progressing into the 21st century, showing that there's an increase in the rates of distress among young people. And then, of course, we know that there's other problems with geography, the boundaries that mental health services put in place in terms of service criteria. And then I guess there's a question of, once you do access mental health services, how can we be assured that it's actually evidence-based? Are there mechanisms in place to assure what we call fidelity to good quality treatment? That's also been a significant issue of concern, which of course then goes to the effectiveness of those treatments once they're accessed. So these are just some of the problems that we know about already in mental health, both treatment and service delivery. So the question that researchers and clinicians, policy developers have been increasingly putting their minds to is the question of what's the scope for digital interventions to address some of these shortcomings, some of these problems. And here are just some of the areas of potential development and innovation that have, and many of these have already been paid significant attention to in various research settings. Assessment and diagnosis could be scaled up and made more accessible, therefore, providing a sort of quicker access into treatment or easier access into treatment. I have to say, as an experienced clinician myself, it's difficult enough to navigate the mental health system. It's difficult enough to refer someone who you're concerned about through the various gatekeeping mechanisms. So perhaps digital interventions have a role to play there. Provision of evidence-based psychotherapy content by kind of standardizing and increasing the kind of fidelity to evidence-based interventions. Perhaps it's possible to increase the quality and the effectiveness. We know, of course, that there's many standalone apps that address mental health problems, and there's been various reviews of those apps published in the research literature recently. I'll come to some of the kind of summary of the outcomes of that soon. We also know that there's a potential for peer-led systems, that is, those with lived experience of mental health problems to contribute in perhaps an online community format to the support of others, or carers too, who've had lived experience to support carers. And there are also many therapist-led web-based systems, and there's varying levels of support that therapists provide within these emerging and developed systems. Virtual reality is another emerging area. It's gone well beyond just, I guess, things like exposure to feared specific situations to even virtual environments to address social fears, and for people experiencing very severe mental health problems such as hallucinations in the context of psychoses. There's also some really interesting developments in avatar therapy around some of those experiences. There's many successful web-based systems developed as a stepped care model. So, for example, for people presenting with mild to moderate problems, using kind of standardized interventions with little by way of clinician support as an initial first level of intervention. And digital interventions to supplement or to be integrated with face-to-face care. That's another important area of development, as well as tools to provide feedback, timely feedback to clinicians to help them understand the quality and the fidelity of their interventions. I just have a shot here, an example of an innovation that I've been involved in, moderated online social therapy, which really combines several of these elements into one system. Happy to say that the Victorian government, in combination with the Telstra Foundation, is supporting the rollout of most at the moment to Victorian youth mental health services. Now, here's a provocative paper that was recently published in The Conversation, really raising the question, and this was the authors John McInnes from the University of South Australia and Ben Morrison from Macquarie, as to whether the job of psychologists is in fact safe in the digital age. Will psychologists be replaced by robots? A very provocative question. I guess the analogy I like to draw is between the robot and the drone. Now, it might well be the case that the drone can replace many of the functions of an aeroplane, but would we be happy sitting in an aeroplane on a long-haul flight knowing that there was no pilot up the front of the aircraft if the risk was high? I suspect probably not. And I guess that probably reflects many of our kind of responses to the idea of digital interventions replacing the role of the compassionate therapist or mental health clinician, or indeed peer worker. Having said that, don't dismiss robots altogether. Even that is an emerging area of important research. Nicole Robinson, for example, from the Queensland University of Technology, has recently synthesised a lot of the research into what's called social robots, particularly, most of that work has been done with children with developmental disorders, for example. And the summary of that is that, look, this is a very early emerging but interesting area of research that needs really to progress to, more fully developed trials and so forth. Now, if you're a skeptic or even questioning whether technology could be useful or perhaps even harmful, that's true, that there is certainly a lot of research to highlight many of the concerns that we all perhaps encountered with digital technology. Many of us have probably seen the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, which really highlights very well the problem of setting up a system designed to achieve a unitary outcome, that is, capture our attention. And you might like to ask yourself, when was the last time you spent a full hour reading a book without any interruption. It's a rather sobering kind of reflection. Certainly I find that's the case. And so we have certainly paid a price, I would say a psychological price, for the demand on our attention through the so-called attention economy. There's a price for distraction. And others researchers have said there also seems to be a price in terms of self-concept, that is, replacing true connectedness with a kind of more superficial level of endorsement. So that, on the other hand, however, this technology does provide a sort of proof of concept that technology can in fact change our behaviour through these sorts of mechanisms here. So could it also change our behaviour in positive ways? And here's a sort of synthesis of the evidence so far for digital interventions in mental health problems. Certainly does increase our access or the ability of people to access mental health interventions. Perhaps you might like to try the experiment of reaching for your favourite digital device. And I guess it's probably not too far away, and going into the Play Store and just searching mental health. And my hunch is that if you keep scrolling, you'll still be scrolling through the App Store at the end of my presentation, maybe at the end of the next presentation. So there's a proliferation of these apps available. Many of them are endorsed by end users. They do endorse them as a preferred access sometimes to mental health services. And there's certainly the potential for scalability and reach. And the evidence for their effectiveness is growing. It's building across disorders and populations slowly but steadily. The caveats are that many of these apps have no evidence whatsoever. So an analogy might be having, 300 COVID-19 vaccines out there and only 2 of them are actually evidence-based. Well, we wouldn't tolerate that situation. So clearly there's a need for greater regulation in this space. Long-term engagement is an issue. There's a problem of the so-called cliff effect in many digital mental health interventions, where high numbers of people will download an app, for example, perhaps press on it once and never use it again, and so on. We get this sort of drop-off effect. The magnitude of effects, and by that I'm really talking about the statistical effect in terms of benefit of many of these applications, tends to, at this stage, be in the low to sort of moderate range. And there's issues with the quality of many of these studies, particularly in terms of the sorts of ways in which these interventions have been compared with other, comparators, if you like. And we know little about the risks of these sorts of interventions as well, which is increasingly something we need to pay attention to in mental health psychosocial interventions. So Toby referred to self-determination theory in his presentation. And he's right that these 3 needs, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, turn out to be, on the basis of decades of research, what appear to be universal psychological needs. And they do seem to be intricately linked with behaviour change, positive behaviour change. So in short, if the environment supports these needs, if the environment supports our need for autonomy and choice and authenticity, and to feel competent and capable of making change and connected with others, then behaviour change is more likely. And this has emerged across many fields of human endeavour: health, education, the workplace, and even in digital technology. It seems if our interventions can address and support these needs, then behaviour change is more likely. And so if we're going to achieve this in mental health, it seems that co-design is critical, partnering with those with lived experience from the beginning. True partnerships in design is absolutely critical to make sure that we're focusing on outcomes that really matter, that really do reflect the perceived and actual psychological well-being, as well as, does it work? Do the mechanisms of change that we're putting up in these interventions, are they actually borne out through the evidence? There's a problem also of motivation in this space. What is it that actually engages the end user in the intervention? Can we actually engage their intervention? Self-determination theory also seems to be very important there. If we can truly engage people's psychological needs, they're much more likely to describe themselves as being motivated for change and to follow through with behaviour change. I'm very aware of time, so I'll just kind of highlight these final areas very quickly. That digital technology certainly provides tremendous scope for assessment in ways that we could never practice with traditional means. Think of wearables, for example, and technology that enables us to measure behaviour and attitudes in real time. The current research priorities in this area include things like how can we sustain engagement over the period of risk, over the period of time needed? How can we deepen the effectiveness of interventions, go from small effects to larger effects, which really comes down to how can we sustain behaviour change? And for whom does it work? Not just rolling out things in an app store, but really making sure that our interventions are right for particular communities. And can it really be effectively scaled, and what's the right level of human support within these interventions? And these are, I think, the potential pitfalls. Lack of co-design, lack of adequate resources, seeing digital interventions as a kind of low-cost alternative, and the risk of building legacy systems because technology moves on so rapidly and so quickly, and making sure we're looking after people's rights, people's human rights for safety by building trusted systems. We're also certainly going to need new skills in this workforce, I would say. And it's not that we all need to become programmers, but these are skills that we need to, I suppose, build into the larger mental health workforce. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I was mute. Thank you so much, John. What a terrific and thought-provoking presentation. There was a lot in there. I know I was particularly interested. I've got a background some time ago in implementation research. So the notion of how you're pairing new technologies with known and evidence-based therapies, but then those the slide on mechanisms really resonated with me about how you're looking at whether or not you retain the effectiveness of those interventions at scale, and using these different modes of delivery is one that's really of particular interest to me. So thank you. Again, if you've got questions or thoughts, please put them in the chat and we'll come to those in a discussion at the end. It's now my pleasure to welcome our final speaker for today, Dr. Valentina Lorenzetti, who is the Deputy Director at ACU's Healthy Brain and Mind Research Centre. It's terrific to have you here too today, Valentina. Valentina's research examines vulnerability to and recovery from brain and mental health harms in chronic addictions and psychological disorders. Valentina is going to talk to us today about findings, progress and developments in brain change, addiction and mental health and wellbeing. So you are very welcome, and we look forward to your presentation, Valentina. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for having me here. It's a real privilege. Let me just start sharing my screen. There you go. Fantastic. There you go, full screen. And fantastic. So thanks so much for having me here. It's a real privilege to, talk about, to share a little bit about our research as well, and in the hope that it can help us understand a little bit better gambling behavior and why it's so hard to quit and cut down gambling, and how to boost resilience. So the first slide here is really about providing a bit of a neuroscience perspective, is overviewing the fact that, I'm going to talk about the neuroscience perspective on gambling disorders. We study how addiction affects the brain to help identify treatment targets. We use neuroimaging tools that take high resolution pictures of the brain in people with addiction. So this is like as if you have a camera with a very high resolution to take, a picture with a high level of detail on the brain. And communication with people who study gambling using different perspectives is really critical. It's very critical to put our findings from neuroscience into a real life context where actual people live. The first part I think is quite important is to really highlight that gambling disorders are associated with brain dysfunction in the same way that addictions to cocaine, heroin, or any other substances affect the brain. Even though gambling is not equivalent to using a substance, we actually see brain changes that we observe with other substances as well. So for example, in this slide, you can see a part of the brain, right? We don't need to worry so much about the detail, but there are a bunch of regions in purple in here that get really activated when people are actually gambling. Yeah, and this is really the center of pleasure of in the brain. Okay, this center of pleasure gets activated when we eat sugar, when you drink your favorite coffee, when people use cocaine, when people use substances. It's the same pleasure center of the brain that gets activated when people are gambling, and that's why gambling itself can be quite rewarding. There you go. The second part is really about, mapping out the addiction cycle in the brain. So when people with gambling disorders are experiencing withdrawal and negative affect, or they are stressed, so imagine, for example, being stressed because of COVID, or because thinking about losses, thinking about implications of losses for the family, being isolated and so on, then we know that the stress center of the brain, which includes another bunch of brain regions, are also is really heavily implicated and activated and dysfunctional in people with gambling disorders. And finally, when people, in reaction to stress, they start, thinking about gambling, and they're thinking about, payday and how to use, the money for gambling, rather than when people might, pass by a gambling venue, then that's when there's another part of the brain that gets activated when you start getting preoccupied or anticipating gambling. Now, this could be like anticipating gambling as if it's something fun to do. So imagine yourself thinking about anticipating going on a holiday, right? Usually when I say this sentence, people have a bit of a smile in their faces. It's really powerful, anticipating a reward, yeah, in terms of motivating our behavior, rather than thinking about going for a holiday. Something pleasurable might trigger a bit of a smile, because it could be a relief from feeling stressed at the moment, to wrap work up before the holiday break. So this is in a similar way, what happens in people with gambling disorders when they get preoccupied, anticipate going gambling. They might anticipate, to go gambling for fun rather than go gambling as a relief. And here we go. So gambling affects the brain in a similar way, as I said earlier, as other substances do. And this is really deeply rooted in our brains. There's some emerging research that also shows that, there you go, that also shows that the brain of people with gambling disorders is also very vulnerable to gambling cues. As you can see in here, you can see different brains, people without gambling and people with gambling. And these are how much brains get activated, brain function get activated when people look at pictures of gambling venues, pictures of wins, pictures of pokies, and so on and so forth. So as you can see here, there's a lot of activation and conditioning in the brain of people with gambling disorders compared to in the brain with people who don't have gambling. This is really to show that looking at gambling related pictures or stimuli or thinking about gambling really activates some parts of the brain that are again implicated in reward and pleasure. Another very powerful slide that has been very cited in the field of neuroscience is about the brain of people with gambling disorders to interpret near misses like wins. So when people with gambling disorders win money, that here is the center of the brain fully activated. Again, it's the same part of the brain that gets activated when you eat sugar rather than you do something really pleasant. Yeah. And this is what happens in the brain with gambling disorders when they have near misses. You can see that the same center of pleasure gets activated a lot. Okay, so this is a very powerful slide because it does show the near misses in the pokies really matter, because people interpret them like wins and they're very rewarding. So perhaps it points to the need of, you know, regulating near misses as well, because they really are addictive, they really are rewarding, and people are really looking forward to not only winning but also near misses, because they are processed like pleasurable events. This is another slide that shows a little bit how the brain changes over time, because our brain changes over time at all times, whether we exercise, whether we eat in certain ways, whether we learn how to ride a bike, and whether we gamble over time and over again. So at the start, you can see when people just gamble for fun, like with friends, here just put up positive pictures here, gambling with friends and for fun. At the initial stages of gambling, we can see that the parts of the brain that get activated are here in a part of the brain that is called the ventral brain reward system. So in this part of the brain is the part of the brain that again gets activated when you do things for fun, okay, when you look for a reward. However, over time, when people gamble because they are addicted to reduce stress and reduce craving, and because of habit, at chronic stages of gambling, when people, for example, are hooked in front of a poker machine and they just keep going back there in a very much habitual way, then we can see that other parts of the brain actually start highlighting, right, and turning up. And it's called the dorsal striatum. So in people with gambling disorders, we can see that only the green part gets activated when gambling, no longer this part. And this is very powerful because it does show how the brain changes when you transition from gambling for fun at the very start to gambling because it's habit and because it's become a compulsion and release of stress. So perhaps this is important because it does really show that perhaps the reason why it's so hard to cut down and quit gambling is because it's very deeply rooted in the brain. It's something that is very hard to undo. And the big question is, how do we go back there? And there's a number of psychological therapies, and sometimes the only thing to go back there is really by quitting, as many therapists have mentioned over time. Now, how do we go back? So we've been doing some research in regards to mindfulness-based therapies to boost brain changes and break the cycle of addiction. What we do know based on the evidence and meta-analysis is that practicing mindfulness-based therapies lowers the amount of gambling amount, craving withdrawal, stress, in general stress levels. And also it does boost cognitive control, attention and awareness. So if you have a look at this picture here is the brain, that I've shown you before in terms of the addictive brain. You can see in blue, you can see that there's some brain centers that are really boosted by mindfulness. And the idea is that boosting activity in these brain regions could actually help breaking the addiction cycle. Now, something very important about this slide is that these mindfulness-based therapies that have been shown to lower gambling amount, craving and withdrawal, they're not necessarily only the 12-week programs, the full 12-week programs that require a lot of reliability, attending sessions in on time with a group of people. These mindfulness-based therapies are varied. Even a 5-minute mindfulness practice or a couple of minute mindfulness practice has been shown to help reducing withdrawal and stress, for example. Compassion focused therapies as well have been shown to really help. So one take-home message from this is that there isn't just one way of helping people using mindfulness-based therapies. It's very important to tailor the intervention to the person and to the context, depending on how much time someone has to work with the person with gambling disorders. And the last slide is really about take-home messages. The first one is it's very important to remember that gambling disorders do affect the brain in the same way addiction to drugs do, including hard drugs like opiates and cocaine. And the second take-home message is that mindfulness-based therapies are low cost and can be delivered online, and they may be useful to help break the addiction cycle and therefore to boost resilience. And that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Valentina. That was a terrific presentation. Once again, 3 really different, really thought-provoking presentations. I certainly learnt plenty there. I was really interested in that slide that you put up that showed the difference in the brain when gambling for fun, or when it feels fun, versus when it's being used within an addictive cycle and it's no longer producing that pleasurable response. We have now come to the end of our formal presentations, but we do have some time, a little bit of time for some Q&A, and I know we've had some sent in, but please use the chat if the last couple of speakers have prompted you to think of other questions that you'd like answered by our speakers while we have the opportunity on the call. So I'm just going to start with a couple of questions for Toby, if that's okay, Toby. I don't know that I can see you on the screen. Yep. So the first one has been sent in by Lindsay Shaw. Thank you, Lindsay. And the question is, it sounds as if prevention is very important, especially for new growing suburbs. Does that make the council's health and wellbeing plans for these communities extremely important to create a strong, connected community?
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. It's an interesting, the simple answer is yes. I think, I was looking at a plan for, well, it's public, so I don't need to be coy on their behalf, Cardinia-Shire. And it's interesting, they highlight their 7 actions as being around improving mental health and well-being, improving social cohesion, improving safety, reducing family violence, reducing obesity, reducing financial vulnerability, and reducing harm from tobacco, alcohol, drugs, and gambling. Now, so you kind of, Cardinia-Shire in presenting that is really reflecting what many councils know, which are the interconnections and the need to address a range of systemic triggers across it, very much to your question. The challenge that they will have, and even as it's presented, is that they are normally addressed more or less in isolation, rather than being approached as a truly systemic set of challenges requiring a truly systemic set of responses, and or given the question, early interventions that are less about a response and are more about anticipation.
Thank you, Toby. Another question for you while you're on a roll. This one's come from Tanya Fletcher, and I, having read it, it's something I was thinking about when you were speaking too. And she's asked if you could expand on the idea that the most vulnerable frequently demonstrate the highest resilience. So as you showed in that comparison, so how to engage better with that concept and promote agency?
I mean, one of my most obvious examples of a group who are often seen as vulnerable but who are profoundly resilient are recent arrivals and migrants. They have generally demonstrated a whole suite of coping mechanisms and resilience to get here in the first place. I'm obviously talking about more as sort of refugees and rather than the kind that the government refers to as desirable immigrants. If you take a look at that and then how we actually approach them, too often what we do, there are some very understandable economic reasons for this. So where is land cheapest? So where is it easiest to put people? But actually in so many things we do in society, we look at cost rather than value. So we look at the cost of putting someone somewhere rather than the savings and the potential benefits of making people truly integrated. Again, many people that, again, I don't want to overgeneralize, which is obviously a prelude to doing so, many people who do arrive here and are seen as, again, vulnerable immigrants and so forth, have come from being phenomenally well qualified, in their countries of origin. And we do very little to really harness those strengths. And what we also see is amongst immigrant groups, and the likes of Johann Hari in his book around connectedness and so forth, have really shown how so much of the unintended actions taken by individuals and groups of people stem from a fundamental lack of connection. So often, and to round this out and give people more space to answer other things, but to Tanya's question, if you take just that single example of, well, actually, let's just, in rounding up, let's just go beyond the immigrant experience. Also, many people who have survived catastrophic events or profound challenges in life have demonstrated many strong coping mechanisms. But what we don't do well enough is understand the strengths that have gotten through that and how to build programs around that, rather than focusing on the challenge that is hand and saying that is something that has to be fixed. So how do we identify the desirable, the thriving element in that definition of resilience and work out pathways to get that rather than trying to whack the problem? And the point around that is on psychology. When you look across a spectrum of the population, most people are drawn to a desirable thing rather than running from the scary things. So joy and desire tend to win out over fear is the basic approach.
Thank you, Toby. A related question from some of your work, but it's a neuroscience question. So I guess if John and Valentina can be ready for this one. This comes from Tony Clarkson. So picking up on Toby's point about the protective quality of social and personal connectedness, what does neuroscience teach us about these connections? What's happening in the brain when we're feeling connected to others?
Oh, fascinating. I think that's straight to John and Valentina.
Yeah, well, the brain also releases other hormones related to pleasure, but they're a little bit different. It wouldn't be like dopamine, that usually is a hormone that you will get released when you feel pleasure, like I've illustrated in these pictures. There's other hormones that are more related to feeling attached, like the attachment hormones, like oxytocin and so on. And these hormones are really powerful, and they activate another network of regions in our brain that is really protective, and in a way directly results into reducing stress levels and stress hormones in the brain as well. Therefore, there is a lot of value into social cognition, not only because we feel that and we know that in our day-to-day, but also there's a real thing that happens in the brain when we're socially connected with others, and that's very powerful.
Thank you, Valentina. Now, I am conscious of time, but I'm really keen to slip in one last question if I can. This one's for you, John. So thinking about the peer-led systems, are you aware of any well-used evidence-based ones that support carers? And that's a question from Tanya. We can't hear you, John.
Thanks, Alison. That's a great question. And I guess, again, I would say you've got to think about the specific populations, because I think the needs in carer populations vary depending on the particular challenge that they're facing. I mean, certainly I'm aware of a lot of work that's been done in the area of enduring psychosis, for example, or the carers of young people facing early psychosis or bipolar disorder. Because we know that those carers are often very stretched, and even accessing appointments can be extremely difficult. Just getting to a clinic type of setting, certainly during traditional hours, is very difficult. So this is where I think peer-led, peer-supported, asynchronous sorts of online community networks can be so helpful. So yeah, very, very happy to share more information about that, Tanya, if you've got any follow-up questions.
Thank you so much, John. I'm sure people will have follow-up questions, and I've failed my sole KPI, which is to finish us on time. So I'm really sorry, everyone, for keeping you over and indulging in those last questions. I just really want to thank all our speakers. I know Aunty Georgina and Michaela have both already had to leave, but to thank them, to thank Toby, John and Valentina. Thank you for really 3 very different but interlinked and thought-provoking presentations. I really enjoyed it. Thanks to everyone who posed questions and thinking about things afterwards as well. I'm sure our speakers, well, as John's just said, happy to hear other queries as well as all the thinking continues. So I wish you all the best for the rest of your Monday and of course the rest of the week. Thank you very much. That's the end of the session, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having us. Thanks for the great event.